Tres Hermanos Ranch is kind of last of its type in our area, a 2,500 acre ranch between Diamond Bar and Chino Hills, owned by the City of Industry for the last 40 years. And I will talk about a little bit at the end about the future of it, or at least what's been discussed as possibilities for that future. We're going to get into the history though here and go from the Mexican period of California on up through the Tres Hermanos, who were not blood related, although they had a shared genealogy in the oil industry. And we'll focus mainly on the period up to the time that they owned the ranch, 1910s and afterwards, and a little bit at the end about the future. So again, thank you for joining us today. As I said, the last of its kind, I had the opportunity just about 2 years ago to go on an airplane flight that was over the Chino and Puente Hill systems. It was set up by a local conservation organization. And it happened to be April, so we had had enough rain that year to provide the beautiful green carpet you see here. This is Tres Hermanos. To give you an idea of the directioning, we're looking south from just a little bit below the 60 freeway, looking towards Orange County. The street running through the middle of the ranch is Grand Avenue. On the right is Diamond Bar, and on the left is Chino Hills. So the flight gave me an opportunity to see a lot of this area and really get a different kind of feel for the landscape. And you can hike very close to Tres Hermanos Ranch, particularly the Chino Hill side. There are a couple of trail systems that will give you some decent views of parts of the ranch, and you can get a little bit of a feel for that as well. A little bit closer up view here, the body of water there just above Grand Avenue, kind of below center, is Arnold Reservoir, which was created in the 1910s by the three brothers who owned the ranch at the time. Just above that, you can see a clump of trees. There's kind of a clearing area there, and what you're looking at would be the ranch headquarters area. There's a small knoll in the center of the photograph that's had the ability to had the ranch house. Sorry. So, and then there were some outbuildings off to the left there. And again, another view looking more towards the south. So as you go down towards the right side of the screen, you're getting into the Tonner Canyon area. The whole area was really Tonner Canyon at one point, and down towards Brea. And so just behind the brown hills there on the right side would be Carbon Canyon, and then over into Orange County. When I do these presentations, I try as much as possible to talk about the native peoples of our area, because we tend to leave them out when people start thinking about the written history. The indigenous people had different names that were assigned to them. One that was very common, you can see on the screen here, Gabrielino, or Gabrieleño is another way to put that. And those people had a wide-ranging area through much of greater Los Angeles, basically San Juan Capistrano on the southeast, up to the Inland Empire on the east, up towards the San Fernando Valley on the northwest side, and the San Gabriel Mountain Range also on the north. And these weren't obviously defined boundaries. It was relatively fluid, but the Gabrieleños did occupy this area for untold millennia generations. I just want to point out some of the village names on this 1920s map. So on the far right, there's a circle that says Pasino. That's Pasignoda. That would be a Chino Hills area. And that, if you know the Boys Republic youth facility off the 71 freeway at Grand Avenue, that's about where that village was located. Above that to the left is Pomona, and you can see Tuibi. That was another village nearby. Over to the left between the E and the L in Gabrielino is Awi or Awigna. That was La Puente. And then down below, there is the Santa Ana River, which has a solid line and then a dash line, and Hutuk or Hutukna was the village out in that area. And I mentioned those four villages because the area in between, where you're going to have some water from Brea Canyon, water from the Chino Creek that empties into Santa Ana River, as you can see on the bottom there towards the center. You're going to have the water sources. You're going to have the ability to hunting and gathering in the Chino Hills area. So the Tres Hermanos area didn't have a village, but it was probably used extensively for hunting, gathering, and also just travel in between the Inland Empire and the coastal plains. Now, during the Spanish and Mexican periods of California, what there were ranchos. We're often familiar with these. And those ranchos were affiliated mostly with the mission system, although there were a few private grants that were made. So on the top left, for example, is San Rafael Rancho. That was very early grant, 1780s, to a private citizen. But most of the ranchos you see on this detail of a map that was done in the late 1920s show you ranchos that were part of the mission system. In the center in gray is La Puente. That is the rancho later owned by the Workman and Rowland families, our homestead, and our museum is located obviously on that rancho. The areas with the hash lines almost look like forward slashes. Those were the public lands that were set aside so that as these land grants and these ranchos became privately owned, there was extra grazing lands available to the rancheros there. So our area that we're talking about is in the bottom right. It'd be the southeast corner of Los Angeles County. There are forward slash marks, and you can see the delineation there of the hills. And there's a small little rancho in red that says Los Nogales, and that is part of what we're talking about today. But that Chino Hills area was public land. To give another example, you can see the Puente Hills just above El Camino Real, very dark black colored areas. Those denote the Puente Hills system. So those public lands were in existence under Spain and Mexico. But once the Americans took over in the late 1840s by seizing Mexico and Alta California, eventually those public lands were sold to private citizens. This is a much later map that shows what was going on with the oil industry, and we'll be talking about that more as well. But I wanted to point out, just about in dead center there, it says Cañada del Rodeo, and that word rodeo we see in Beverly Hills, for example, with Rodeo Avenue, and this is the actual area where there was a body of water going through that is now Brea Canyon. But if you look down at the bottom, very bottom right, you can see a little bit of the word Brea Canyon. That is actually Tonner Canyon. So the Brea Canyon we know today was actually a different name for many, many years. But I wanted to bring that attention to you as well so you can get an idea of some of the landmarks and the natural features. And we'll come back and talk about the oil aspect a little bit later. Now, eventually what happened is that the name was given of Tonner Canyon. You can see that at the very top center, the name Tonner. But that canyon runs to the left and then curves down to where you see Chino on the left side of the screen. And so again, the Tres Hermanos Ranch would be where Tonner is and outside of the map there. Patrick Tonner was an Irishman who lived in the Pomona area for many years and got the canyon named for him. He was an interesting figure. He was a poet. He was a school teacher. He had some real estate endeavors. You can see a copy here of a newspaper article that talks about a project he had on what was called Rancho San Jose. That would be the furthest east rancho within Los Angeles County we now know as Pomona, San Dimas, Laverne, those areas. And in the 1870s, he and one of the original family members from the Rancho San Jose, Francisco Palomares, and others, had a contract with a very long name group there, the LA Immigration and Land Cooperative, misspelled, Association. That group actually got a lot of its funding from the Temple and Workman Bank that was owned by William Workman, who founded our site, and his son-in-law, FPF Temple. This was in the 1875 period of time. You can see at the bottom of the article, it talks about the Artesia colony. That was another town that they had set up at the same time. And it says the tract is between Los Angeles and Spadra. Spadra is actually a community that is now part of Southwest Pomona, along the line of the Southern Pacific Railroad. Now, the little Rancho Los Nogales that I had pointed out to you in that earlier map was about 1,000 acres. So to give you an idea, La Puente, which was to the west of Nogales, was almost 49,000 acres. So La Puente was about the largest you could have under Mexican land law. Los Nogales was one of the smallest of the ranchos in Los Angeles County. It was granted to a family Nevada, and there's a Nevada Street in the City of Industry today over in the area near Diamond Bar. The Nevadas didn't hold on to the property particularly long. A lot of these ranchos were transferred, sold, that sort of thing over the years. And the Behar family, who owned the southern part of Rancho San Jose, which is the ranch on the north side of the map there. You can see there's a line that's the boundary between Los Nogales and Rancho San Jose. If you know the area, that would be Temple Avenue, pretty much going by Cal Poly and into Diamond Bar, Cal Poly Pomona to Diamond Bar. Ricardo Behar was one of the grantees with Ignacio Palomares of Rancho San Jose back in the late 1830s, and Behar was able to acquire Rancho Los Nogales from the Avada family later on. The map here was done in 1857 by a surveyor named Henry Hancock. You might know that name from Hancock Park, which was developed by his son. Now, Los Nogales, as I said, started off quite small, but you'll see with the subsequent maps here, it got enlarged over time. And the reason for this, pretty simply, is that the public lands that were available to the east in the Chino Hills complex were purchased and added to the rancho over time. So this is an 1869 map. It's about a dozen years after the one we just saw. And during that period, those public lands were starting to become available for private ownership. You can see the names of Ibarra and Bejar on this particular rendering of Rancho Los Nogales. A couple years later, another survey was done by a man named Lothar Siebold, and Siebold provided some interesting geographic detail. You can see some of the landforms. It says Broken Hills, kind of right of center. There's a delineation of low hills. The line at the left that kind of goes straight from the bottom left, makes a sharp right turn and an angle and so forth. That's the boundary line with Rancho La Puente. So as you get to the upper center of the map there, that's about where Cal Poly would be located today in that general area. Now, what happens invariably with these properties is they get sold. There are a lot of reasons why people sell land. There's an old term called land rich, cash poor, which means you can have a lot of land, but if you can't make use of it productively to the point where you can pay your property taxes, for example, then it becomes a problem. And there were other issues too. During the 1860s, there was a very severe period of floods followed by drought. We would know that as La Nina and El Nino. They didn't know that back then. And the cattle industry, which is the backbone of the local economy, was crippled by these devastating issues with flood and drought. So a lot of the ranchos were sold during that period. People would borrow money to try and maintain their livelihoods, couldn't pay the loans back and got foreclosed upon. So if you think about 2008 and that period of time, and just sort of think of it in terms of the land going back to the 1860s, you get a feel for that. So eventually the Los Nogales Rancho falls out of the ownership of the Bejar family, and a couple of guys from Los Angeles take over, Wilson Beach and George Butler. Butler was a city treasurer of Los Angeles, as you can see from this excerpt from a newspaper article. He owned a livery stable, had horses in Los Angeles, and Beach was a resident there, and the two of them took over the rancho. But in the 1870s, there's a lot of growth and development going on, a lot of activity happening, and so the ownership of the rancho fluctuated quite a bit. And just to kind of show you how we try to find stuff out about places like this, because the Los Nogales Rancho wasn't particularly famous, there was nobody associated who was really well known, but you just dig through things like here you see a real estate transaction list in the Los Angeles Herald newspaper in September 1874. Actually, almost all of these transactions are for a new town called San Fernando, north of Los Angeles. But at the very bottom, Francisco Bejar et al. Et al. Simply means and others, sold to Beach 184 acres for $5,481. It's those kinds of transactions you look for as you're doing your research. Here's another example of that, where Butler is giving some land to Beach on Los Nogales for $24,000. And the prices really jumped up in the mid-1870s because it was a boom. There was a bit of a growth spurt in Los Angeles. People were coming here in fairly large numbers. The railroads were coming in, and there was a lot of economic activity. So the real estate market was pretty hot, and values were pretty high. Also at the bottom were two other individuals that Beach then turned around and gave interest to. Charles Wright, who we're going to mention a little bit later, and a guy named Spencer Wilson. So just an indication that these properties would be purchased, sold, you get multi-interest and that sort of thing. Now, eventually what happens is that the boom goes bust here in greater Los Angeles in 1875 and 76. The state economy collapsed because of a stock bubble involving silver mining in Virginia City, Nevada. One of the casualties of that bust was the Temple and Workman Bank, which was very heavily leveraged in all kinds of investments and collapsed in early 1876. And so Beach is one of the casualties also. He winds up selling his interest in Los Nogales to Charles Wright, who I just mentioned a moment ago. Wright was another guy who owned a livery stable. He was a stagecoach driver. So these were not wealthy people, but they were able to accumulate enough money to buy property like you see here. And then there's a guy named Sedgwick Lynch who comes down from Santa Cruz. He was a lumber baron, a lot of redwoods up in the mountains between San Jose, Silicon Valley, and Santa Cruz and the coast. And Lynch wanted to get into Los Angeles and expand his business. So he formed a partnership with a lumber person in Los Angeles, and they had an enterprise down in downtown for a while. And Lynch invests in the rancho here with Charles Wright. They become the two owners by the end of the 1870s. One of Lynch's lumber operations was in this location. You see a long, low building with a wood roof here in the foreground. By the way, in the back, right behind that, is one of the early Methodist churches, or pardon me, Lutheran churches, and on the hill, the first Los Angeles high school. The enterprise there in the foreground, the lumber yard, happened to also be popular, unfortunately, for vigilantes who lynched a number of people from a gate post on the other side of the building here. So this is a view of early Los Angeles at a very rough time in its history. Now, what Lynch wound up doing, because the economy was so poor and people were in trouble, that Beach and Butler were in financial distress. They also had a partner, Isaiah W. Hellman, a very prominent banker in Los Angeles. He had been the partner, in fact, of William Workman and FPF Temple in the banking business before they split up. Hellman later ran Wells Fargo and the Bank of Nevada and became one of the wealthiest people in Western America. In any case, Lynch foreclosed on a mortgage, and that's how he was able to take over most of Rancho Los Nogales by the end of the 1870s. He died a couple years later, and so his widow, Jane, took over, and Jane Lynch and Charles Wright ran that ranch from basically the late 1870s into the early 1900s. It didn't appear that the land was used very differently over that long stretch of almost 30 years. Cattle, sheep, horses, probably some farming in the area where basically Valley Boulevard runs through the area going from La Puente into Pomona. But in the early 1900s, there's a big change in the ownership of the property. Walter Fundenberg, who was a real estate investor and dentist from Pittsburgh, came to the area and acquired a citrus ranch out in Riverside. And he began looking for other property. So he bought the Los Nogales Rancho. And in this article, the very first sentence says that he has completed the purchase of the 8,000-acre property. So remember, the ranch began as only about 1,000 acres back in the 1840s in the Mexican era. But because of that expansion of it with the public land purchases, it was 8,000 acres by the time that Fundenberg acquired it. This is 1907. It also says it was purchased from Jane Lynch and heirs, and that the price was $250,000. So obviously prices had gone up a lot over the years. Now, even though Fundenberg was a orange grower in Riverside, his principal interest in this property, and it talks about it at the very end of the article, where it says there are strong indications of oil on the ranch. The ranch is favorably located for it, as the Puente oil fields dovetail it on the north. Actually, that's the west. Union oil wells and Brea Canyon lie on the west of it, more like the southwest. So much for media accuracy. But the point is that Fundenberg was hoping that he was going to find oil because there had been a gradual discovery of oil in the Puente Hills, down in the Brea area, and he was looking to cash in. He spent 10 years trying to prospect for oil and was not successful. It turned out that there wasn't the favorability that this article talked about. So what happened then is Fundenberg, after about a decade, sold off most of the ranch to a guy named Frederick Lewis, who was a officer executive with a tire company back on the East Coast, and he was known for being a yachtsman. So the rich and famous out there often had their yachts and that sort of thing. And so Lewis bought this property, or part of it, from Fundenberg in the 1910s, and was able to develop part of that into what he called the Diamond Bar Ranch, and that's where the city of that name got its moniker from, was from Frederick Lewis buying that property. This is the late 1910s. You can see at the bottom of the article there, it says the Fundenberg Ranch is one of the best known properties in the Spadra district. So it doesn't even say Pomona, even though Spadra became part of that. It consists largely of grazing land and takes in a part of a long range of hills extending from Walnut to Chino. So again, that's going to be the area where the Tres Hermanos come into this. And they talk about the fact at the end of this article that Fundenberg did considerable prospecting but never struck a paying well out there. So this is a 1920s detail of a map. And you can see on the left, there are a couple of sections of land. Sections are 160-acre squares. And Frederick E. Lewis has the western part there. That was what he acquired from Fundenberg. And in the middle are a couple of squares or sections with the names of Harry Chandler, W.B. Scott, and W.R. Rowland. And that's where we get into the Tres Hermanos part, because basically Rancho Los Nogales is split into two pieces: Lewis's Diamond Bar Ranch and the Tres Hermanos Ranch. Incidentally, to the top, upper right there, you can see Luis Phillips. He was a guy who owned much of the Pomona area, and the Phillips Ranch section of the city is named for him. On the bottom right says Chino Land, and then some Chino Land and Water Company. That would be the Chino Rancho on the San Bernardino County side. So the county line basically ran right through this area between Los Angeles and San Bernardino counties. Now, about these three brothers who were not related, William B. Scott was from Missouri and came to California as a young man, wound up in the Ventura area, and he got into the oil business. He was basically a laborer first, but became a in-law of the Hardison family. The Hardisons were among the founders of Union Oil, which became Unocal. And so Scott got his entree into oil company ownership through his in-laws. And he had a variety of different businesses over the years in the oil industry. Among those would be a firm called Columbia. That's on the top left or upper left of this 1920s map that kind of hones in on the Tres Hermanos and Olinda area and what is now Brea. And so he was a pretty active guy in the oil area industry in greater Los Angeles. Just to get your bearings here, you can see a road going up from the center towards the top right. That would be what we know as Carbon Canyon Road today, going from Brea into Chino. Scott had a lot of business partners over the years. This is an article from the first decade of the 1900s, where it talks about the consolidation of 4 oil companies into one. And the idea here is that you take these enterprises with their capital, you bring them together. Obviously, you've got a lot more money to play with when it comes to doing other projects in whatever industry you happen to be in. So the second paragraph talks about this new firm being called the Columbia Oil Producing Company. So his Columbia Oil, which already existed, was merging with other businesses and maintaining the name and then expanding the amount of money it could use for its investment. So president was William B. Scott, and you can see on the bottom of the left column there, the directors included William R. Rowland, who we'll talk about a little bit later, Harry Chandler as well, Moses Sherman, namesake of Sherman Oaks, also the developer of what became West Hollywood, and some other figures in Los Angeles. On the second column to the top there, it talks about the Rowland Land Company, which owned the other half of the Puente, which means the Rancho La Puente. William's father, John, was the original grantee of that. And William's inherited property on that rancho just happened to have one of the few oil wells in the Puente Hills area, or that section of it anyway. And so we'll talk about him a little bit later. But this article brings together these Tres Hermanos in one business, the Columbia Oil Company. Now, this is a statement later on when the Columbia Oil Company was giving its employees a dividend and thanking them for their loyalty and all their hard work. This is the 1919 summer. And I want to bring your attention to the very last paragraph down there, because this might be a motto for a lot of people. This was what Scott said in public as he was giving out this bonus to his employees: live each day so that you can look every damn man in the eye and tell him to go to hell. So I just love that. I think that's something that we all ought to seriously consider as we think about our mottos in life. It says, this has always been the position of the company and also of every man employed by the company, if he was satisfied with himself and sure that he was doing right. So Scott was making assumptions about what people in his company should believe in. Unfortunately, he didn't get to live each day that much longer. He actually passed away the next year in 1920.
Oh, we have a quick question from Allison. She
Absolutely.
asks, which newspapers are these articles from?
They are coming from a variety of papers: LA Times, the Herald, which became the Herald Examiner, and the Los Angeles Express. So those are the 3 that I pretty much drew from on this. All right, and then this article talks about Scott in his passing in 1920, what he had done with his business, his personal life, and all that. It does talk towards the end about his marriage to Luna Hardison. I mentioned that name earlier, the Union Oil Company founders. There were 2 children, Josephine and Keith. Luna did not live much longer after her husband. I think she died within 4 or 5 years. And so it's Josephine and Keith who will become the heirs to Tres Hermanos. We'll pick up that part of the story just a little bit later. Now, talking more about William Richard Rowland, second of the three brothers in this enterprise. Rowland was married to Manuelita Villanueva, whose father, Isaac Williams, was the owner of the Chino Ranch, just on the other side or east of the Tres Hermanos Ranch. He was born in 1846 on the Rancho La Puente. He was the youngest of his family. His mother, Encarnacion Martinez, was a native of New Mexico. And William was educated up at Santa Clara College, now the University of Santa Clara, came back home to help his father, John, manage the large Rowland portion of Rancho La Puente. But he also decided to get involved in local law enforcement. In 1871, he was elected Los Angeles County Sheriff. He was only 25 years old, so I'm imagining that will be a record that will not be broken. I just can't see a 25-year-old being elected to that position anymore. This is a listing of some of the officers of the city of Los Angeles and the county, including Rowland towards the top as the sheriff. He was known for, probably best known for his role in capturing Tiburcio Vasquez, who was one of the famous bandidos of California from the 1850s to the 1870s. Vasquez was committing robberies and so forth here in greater Los Angeles, and he had robbed a ranchero in the Monterey Park area, an Italian named Repetto. And so Rowland was called out by FPF Temple of the Temple Workman Bank because Vasquez had sent one of the Repetto family to the bank to get money so he could take his winnings and go off in his merry way. And so Temple called Rowland to let him know this was happening. And Rowland went back to the Repetto place, but Vasquez, I guess, got wind of it and took off and escaped into the San Gabriel Mountains. So Rowland's idea from that point onwards was not to personally be involved in trying to capture the bandit. So when Vasquez was holed up in a ranch in West Hollywood area, Rowland's decision was to stay in LA and then have his deputies go out and do the reconnaissance and do the capture so that Vasquez would be caught by surprise. And so Rowland got a nice reward from the state of California for doing that as well. He was sheriff at a couple of different times, mid-1870s and again in the early 1880s. But his big windfall came in 1885. As I mentioned, he had inherited some property on Rancho La Puente that his father had left for him. There was a large family, a lot of different properties, so he just happened to get the one that had the oil on it. And if you know where Harbor Boulevard comes in from Orange County, crosses the Puente Hills, and becomes Fullerton Road in Rowland Heights, just to the east of that was where this property was. And so Rowland and a partner named William Lacey in Los Angeles opened up the Puente Oil Company. Interestingly, oil companies later on would send their product by pipelines down to the harbor area for obvious reasons. But this is way before that, the mid-1880s. So Rowland actually sent his oil eastward to a brand new town called Chino. And the town was built off a railroad spur line of the Southern Pacific. It seemed to make sense at the time. So this was the refinery that the Puente Oil Company had in the town of Chino. And that's where Rowland made his fortune. He wound up living in a very beautiful home in the hills just to the west of downtown Los Angeles, kept his Rancho La Puente property, misnamed here on the headline as El Puente Rancho, and died in Los Angeles in 1926, just shy of his 80th birthday. I love the headline here, Settler Heroes, Lifespan Ends. I've never seen that term, a settler hero, but we can all start using that now. Finally, there's a third brother, Harry Chandler, a name that might be more familiar to some of you. Chandler was from Vermont, came from a very working class background. This is the 1880 census. The very top there has his father, Moses, his mother, Harry, and two younger children. And his father, as well as Harry, worked in a bobbin mill. They literally made bobbins for sewing machines. So he did not come from wealth. But he was going to Dartmouth College, I think it was, one of the Ivy League schools back east, and supposedly took a dare in the wintertime to jump into a vat of a chemical. And the name has suddenly popped out of my head. I'm not sure what it was. I'll think of it in a moment. But in any case, it was frigid, freezing cold weather. He jumps into this vat and gets a lung condition. And he has to recover. And in fact, they were afraid for his life. So that's how he got to California. A lot of people came to this area for health reasons. Tuberculosis, lots of other health conditions. So there were sanitariums all over the Los Angeles area. And Harry shows up here in the 1880s, barely out of his teens, trying to recover. I think it might have been starch that he jumped into as part of that bet. And what he does is he eventually becomes basically a newspaper carrier for a pretty new paper called the Los Angeles Times, which had opened at the end of 1881. Chandler shows up within a few years of that. And he creates his own paper carrying service. He starts a company to do this and kind of shows a little bit of enterprise. And he gets the attention of one of the owners of the business, Harrison Gray Otis, who wound up becoming the sole owner and publisher of the Times and one of the most powerful people in the Los Angeles area. And so Chandler starts to become more familiar with the Times and vice versa. And he is hired in the circulation department. Now, Chandler had a first wife, by which he had a couple of children, but his wife died young, and Chandler wanted to marry the boss's daughter, Marion Chandler. And that's her there. Marion wound up becoming pretty important in the operation of the Times. So she was unusual in that as a woman, she had the ability to become very involved. Yes, she was the boss's daughter and also the vice president's wife, but she showed a lot of initiative in terms of her involvement in the running of the Times over the years. Now, Chandler was a vice president, basically the right-hand person for his father-in-law in the Times, but whereas Harrison Gray Otis was a journalist, he loved the newspaper business, and that was his big focus. Chandler didn't quite have that interest. He was more involved in real estate and business endeavors. But in 1917, Otis dies, and again, a great headline here. He died on the firing line, which simply meant he ran a newspaper, I guess. But it was the Times version of this, so it talks about his ideals enduring and all that. But with Otis's death, Chandler becomes the owner of the business. But notice at the very bottom, it says that Otis leaves this great newspaper to his trusted associate and to his daughter, herself a newspaper executive of great talents and high vision. So again, it's an interesting phenomenon where Marion has a pretty active role in the running of the Los Angeles Times. Chandler lived the longest of the three brothers. Scott died in 1920, Rowland 6 years later. Chandler lived until 1944, died at the age of 80 after a couple of heart attacks. Now, there's not a lot to be said about Tres Hermanos Ranch in the press, because really what it was a weekend retreat for these three high-powered business owners. They built a ranch house on top of the hill. I pointed it out, talked about it at the very beginning. They stocked it with cattle and horses. They would go out there and hang out. So there's not a lot that was talked about in the papers about it, although this is an article that talks about a 6-course dinner served at the ranch in 1919. There were a number of people invited. You can see the long list here. Moses Sherman, I mentioned before, he was involved in that Columbia Oil Company merger. So there were other folks from LA, Orcutt, if you know that name, from the Ventura area, and other prominent people of the business world of Los Angeles going to this kind of function. At the very end, it says Tres Hermanos Ranch is owned by William Rowland, W.B. Scott, and Harry Chandler, and located in the beautiful Puente Hills near Walnut.
Question,
Some years later, yes, go ahead.
Sandra wants to know, is the ranch house still there?
I will. I'll talk about that at the end. I'm going to save that if that's okay to the end. So yeah, we're almost there, so I'll talk about it for sure. Another article from the early 30s, Great Depression years, a good old-fashioned picnic at the Chandler Tres Hermanos Ranch. And that's said because Rowland and Scott had died by then, although Scott's kids had some interest in the property. And it says, with the traditional ants in shades of red and black, and the usual arguments as to whose chicken salad was the best, baseball and overeating were involved. And again, you can see a list of some of the folks who were there. One other one that was located was, I thought, kind of interesting, which is the spirit of the Old West being brought up as they had a roundup on the property in 1935. 10-gallon hats and jangling spurs weren't there, but they did have people with their cattle and their cattle brands. Unfortunately, they caught the attentions of the state inspector and local law enforcement. And so what this is about was they had to go to court in Chino because some of the cattlemen had not registered their brands with the state as required by law. So there were some fines handed out as a result of that. But again, the ranch was largely used for that purpose, raising cattle and horses all along, really from the 1840s right on up. 1938, another little function where they had baseball and lunch and all that sort of thing. So really, that's what really happened here was occasional visits to have a picnic and a weekend visit and raising the livestock out there. Some years ago, I was fortunate enough to be able to acquire for the homestead a quartet of photographs of Tres Hermanos Ranch from 1925. The young lady on the horse is Josephine Scott, who with her brother Keith was the heir to the property from their father, William B. Scott. That little dirt path that she's next to is Tonner Canyon Road. It's still there, goes along the same route. So you're looking northwards towards where Grand Avenue would be and up towards Diamond Bar and Pomona. That ranch house that I talked about before, and I'll show you some photos of it towards the end and answer that question, would be off to the left there. And again, this is what they would do, come out with their horses, enjoy the ride and the fresh air and all that sort of thing. Another view, slightly, looks like it's a little bit blurry, but a friend of Josephine's out on the property. You can see the cattle behind her, and that's really what it was for, grazing land for all these animals out there. And you're looking probably to the west. So those hills would be in Diamond Bar. There's a place called The Country, which is a gated community with large estates and mansions up in that location today. All right, so in the bottom right corner, that's the Arnold Reservoir that is still there. That berm, which is basically a dam, is still there. They need to do some work on that. It's about 100-something years old. Over towards the left center, you can see a barn, some of the outbuildings. And then behind that, to the right, on the hill, is the ranch house that was built probably again in the late 1910s. This is the porch of the ranch house. That's the same young woman who was on the horse a couple of photos before, relaxing on the hammock, enjoying the nice view up there and the open spaces of the rancho. So those are the 4 snapshots that I was able to pick up some years ago for the Homestead collection. And I haven't really seen any other examples quite like it. Very quickly, I wanted to go through some of the later history for you here and then wrap up with an interesting little side venture that came as a result of trying to find some information for the current owners of the property. The ranch was long leased to a doctor from Pomona named Arnold. That's where the name of the reservoir that's still there came from. And again, Dr. Arnold and his son raised cattle and horses in the ranch. That's what they did for decades and decades. But in the mid-1960s, the Metropolitan Water District ran a feeder line, a major line, through the ranch to get water from the Colorado River Project down to Orange County. At the end of Carbon Canyon on the west side in Brea, there's actually a treatment plant. So that line runs down to the treatment plant and then provides a great deal of the water for people who live down in Orange County. And once that came in, that land became valuable for different reasons. So in the early 70s, the Pomona Valley Water District had plans to buy the ranch and then fill it up with a very large reservoir and then be able to provide water for the city of Pomona and those areas that the district served. So that was a plan going back about 50 years or more. It was not realized, and 6 years later, the City of Industry bought the ranch from Chandis Securities. So Chandis is basically Otis and Chandler combined together. The heirs of Harry Chandler still had the property as late as the late 1970s. Industry was basically going to replicate the Pomona plan, which was to find a way to make the ranch available for water storage and distribution. In the meantime, there was a movement just on the east of that, on the San Bernardino County side, and really part of the ranch is in the county, a great part of it. And it was called the Chino Hills Plan. So that was an effort to try to get a planned community for those areas, now part of the city of Chino Hills. And for a while, there was talk within the City of Industry's ownership of having some housing developments on part of Tres Hermanos, but that also was not realized. So the reservoir came up again in more recent years, and some of you may have heard this in the news. There was a proposed solar farm that was going to be put into Tres Hermanos in lieu of the reservoir. And that moved along in some planning stages for a while, and then eventually also went away. And with some agitation between Chino Hills, Diamond Bar, and City of Industry involving the solar farm, what eventually happened was basically a lunch meeting between the city managers of Chino Hills and Industry. And as a result of that, a decision was made just about a little over a year ago to form a Tres Hermanos Conservation Authority. There had been an organization by that name before, but this is a new version of it. And it involves 7 members, 3 from Industry, 2 from Chino Hills, 2 from Diamond Bar, meeting the city councils, so that they could work out the future of the property. Those cities have been meeting. or were meeting regularly. I think now with COVID, they've been having virtual meetings. And nothing has been offered publicly about what's going to happen there, but there has been talk, and this has been said publicly, about having significant public use of the property. What that entails, nobody can say right now, but that is what has been talked about. So what I'm hoping is that whatever is done that involves public use, that the history of the property will become part of that discussion. And again, like the late night TV commercials, there is more. I had been asked, actually from people in industry as well as Chino Hills, if there was a cattle brand associated with Tres Hermanos that could be used as a logo for the Conservation Authority. Made some calls and got connected to Gwendolyn Garland Babcock, a granddaughter of Harry Chandler. One grandfather was William May Garland, who was the chair of the 1932 Olympic Games in Los Angeles and a big developer in downtown. And then her other grandfather was Harry Chandler. Gwen is in her late 80s now, and I went out to her house in San Marino, and we did an oral history a little over a year ago. And no cattle brand, but she was able to give some great information about her recollections of the ranch, including some photographs. And what she told me was they would go out and do things like this. That's her father. Go out and have family picnics. Not all that often, she said. She said, kind of quietly, well, we also had some ranches out in Tejon, north of Los Angeles, and out in Malibu. And this was kind of the third tier of those three ranches. But you can see they're having their lunch out there. Hunting, so this is her father and her brother doing that. Gwen, by the way, contracted polio as a little girl, so she was not able to do a lot of the activities that her family did, but they always made sure to include her. In fact, her father later on got her a car specially outfitted so she could drive it. And then later, when she decided she wanted to learn how to fly, they had a plane that had special equipment so she could fly the plane. This is the view, I think, probably from the ranch house looking to the north. In the center, that is the berm or the dam behind which is the Arnold Reservoir. That is the ranch house, probably looking almost the view you just saw, looking in the direction.
We have a question about the ranch house, actually, Paul.
Sure, go ahead.
Allison asks, the ranch house is near Grand Avenue, or is there another landmark you can offer?
Yes, it is. The location of it is basically south of Grand Avenue. So if you're driving from Diamond Bar towards Chino Hills on Grand Avenue, you look to your right, you'll see the reservoir, and then behind that, a fair distance, is the knoll on which the ranch house stood.
And then Robert wants to know, has the ranch been explored for native or tribal artifacts?
I don't know if they've done official surveys yet. The Conservation Authority was just set up a year ago. So I know they've been working on things like that dam for the reservoir and getting that repaired. They've been working on some wildlife studies, and I believe some plant studies too. I don't know if they look for archaeological artifacts for Native Americans. As I mentioned at the beginning, there wasn't a village up here. There probably wasn't enough water for that to be sustainable. Most villages were right along creeks and so forth. So if there were anything like that, they'd probably be pretty ephemeral, meaning not super, not a lot of those things, because this is probably used for hunting and gathering and transport and all that, travel through the area.
And then Anne Marie asks, prior to 1978, had the property been leased by different families at different times for residential purposes?
No, the ranch was maintained intact. So it's about 2,500 acres, and about 1,750 of that is in Chino Hills, the rest in Diamond Bar. And no, the original three owners had the property, and then the Chandlers and Scotts had it for a while. And I think the Scotts may have still been owners up until 1978, but it was retained as is, used for cattle grazing. It had no residential purpose other than caretakers living in that house up there until it was sold to the city in 1978. So there really hasn't been any residential use of the ranch to speak of. Another photo here. So this is, again, Gwen's father and brother in the courtyard of the ranch house. He was able to give me a little indication of when you went in the doors, to the left was this, to the right was that. She talked about a big fireplace, some of the furniture and that sort of thing. But the last time she was there was in the late 1950s. So it had been over 60 years. And she apologized for not remembering all these details, but I was kind of impressed that she was able to recall what she did of the property there. And so just to give you an idea here from some of those questions. So in this photograph, if you look dead center and then just to the left, you can see a dark green area. That is the knoll on which that ranch house stood. That was torn down. I moved to Chino Hills in the late 1990s. It was still there, but I think it was gone within a few years of that. I'm not sure why, other than that, houses do decay and maybe there was termite damage. It was significant. I'm not really sure what the situation with that is. And then to the left of that dark green spot where the house was, there's a gray area with some green there, and that would be the areas where you had the outbuildings and so forth. So as I said, as we wrap up here, I'm hoping that there will be a place for the history of this property and whatever the public use is of the ranch. This is a view looking from Diamond Bar northwards towards Phillips Ranch, Pomona area. And just another view here of the Diamond Bar section looking off towards Tonner Canyon as it goes down into Brea. So as we talked about at the very beginning, there are upcoming events here. You can see 4 of the virtual events. We're trying to do a big mix of things here. So photo preservation workshop, ISIS, and one of our other staff members hosts a fiction book club, which you may want to talk about. We have a great female justice program. One of those was done just last week. The next one coming up at the end of May. And then Steve Dugan, one of our staff, is going to do a genealogy basics workshop on May 30th.
Okay, I have several questions and comments I'm going to read. This is a really good time to also add any comments or questions you have. I'm going to be going through as many as I can. So feel free to ask them either on Facebook Live, if you're still on there, or of course in the chat box or Q&A box. So first, let's see, we have some comments. We have Sandra visited the ranch house in the early 1970s. Matt says he's friends with Jeffrey Arnold, who is related to the Arnold family that the reservoir is named after. And he also sees this is being recorded. Will the recording be available later? And the answer is yes, later this week we will have the recording. I'm going to send you guys a link in the chat box. It's already on Facebook Live, but you can find our virtual programs there. Krista asks, so the ranch house is still standing? If so, has the assessment been done of the house? Has an assessment been done of the house?
Yeah, and I was just mentioning that a moment ago. I moved to the area in the late 1990s. The house was there at the time, but it was gone within several years after that. So I'm going to say probably early to mid 2000s, the house was removed. Don't know the reason for that. Again, the house had been built probably about 1918. So it may have just deteriorated to the point where it wasn't worth salvaging, but it's been gone for a number of years now.
On Facebook, Peter says, ironically, Chino Hills, Industry, and Diamond Bar are the new Tres Hermanos. Amanda asks, we have the right to roam laws here in Scotland, meaning anyone can walk, hike through private property. Is this land open to the public for people just passing through?
That's a very interesting question. It is not at this point, no. The property is fenced, there is security there. So whatever the public use of it may be remains to be determined. But at this point, no. You can get pretty close to it. There are some trails, especially on the Chino Hill side, that get you pretty decent views of much of the property. But no, there's no public access right now.
Davina, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, says thank you so much. And Peter says there's a trail on Grand Park on the Chino Hills side where you can get pretty close, but it's fenced. Yeah,
exactly. And right now you can't actually get from the Grand Avenue Park side, but there is a little park called Sunset in Chino Hills. You can obviously look up in your browser, and there is access from the back of the park to trails that get you very close to one of the gates there on the property. So you can get from that side right now because the Grand Avenue Park is closed, obviously, for COVID.
And Robert asks, do we know if there are any remaining historical structures on the ranch?
If there are any, they would be outbuildings that would have been just to the east of the ranch house. That would be the one area. I have not personally been that close to those sections of the property, so I don't know specifically. But if there would be anything left, it would probably be some outbuildings.
And Barbara says, thank you, very interesting.
Great.
And that looks to be almost the last of any questions or comments. I will give you guys 30 seconds to add anything else. And once again, if you're joining from Facebook and you're joining a little late, or if you joined Zoom a little late, the entire lecture will be available on YouTube later this week, and you can find it on our website. And we have some thanks from Pamela and Allison and Maria and Jim and Lizeth and Annette. all have very nice comments.
Well, great. Well, thank you all for participating. Again, you can see on the screen here, if you have any questions you want to email to me once you've thought about it, please do so. I'll be happy to answer.
And it looks like we've got one last question. Denise asks, is oil still being welled?
In that area, I think that was the only time was in the Thundenberg era, 1907 to 1917, roughly. I don't know of any other oil activity on that property. There have certainly been efforts more to the south in Brea Canyon area, but I don't think there's been anything up in the ranch for over 100 years.
And Robert asks, what's the best we can advocate for the ranch to be preserved for public use?
The meetings of the Tres Hermanos Conservation Authority are public. They are held at City of Industry City Hall. As I mentioned earlier, it's a 7-person board, so I think it's council members, 3 from industry, 2 each from Chino Hills and Diamond Bar. So you can certainly attend any of those meetings. I think they are virtual right now. I don't know the dates, but if you go on the City of Industry website, you can find that out. Advocate that way, I think, would be probably the most direct way at this point.
All right, I think that wraps it up. Thank you all for viewing. You'll be sent a response survey also through email if you would like to fill that out. And hopefully we'll see you guys for future programming. And like I said, you can find the recording online later if you would like.